Welcome, everyone. This is a continuation of a talk we did last semester. My name is Tish Hayes. I'm the Information Literacy Librarian here at Moraine, which means I spend a lot of my time working with students on evaluating information, developing research strategies. So that's kind of my perspective as we go into the talk today. Lisa?
And I'm Lisa Couch, and I teach the journalism courses on campus and also work with students who are editors of the Glacier student newspaper. I'm a former journalist myself, and I'm married to a journalist, and so I kind of come at this from that perspective. I teach courses including Journalism 101, which is Intro to Mass Communications, Journalism 111, which is media writing, and Com 154, which is student publications, where I train the editors of the Glacier. So, Tish and I are coming at this from a couple of different directions. And as she said, we're continuing, we're doing part 2 of the talk that we started in the spring called Blame It on the Media, the erosion of trust and truth and what we can do about it. And we sort of got to, in part 1, we talked about the erosion of trust and truth, but we didn't quite get around to what we can do about it because we got carried away with interesting discussion. And so we're back to talk about what we can do about it.
Awesome. So we have our screen sharing going. I hope everyone can see the screen. The title of our talk is Blame It on the Media, the Erosion of Trust and Truth, and what we can do about it. Lisa, did you want to share any more?
Yeah, just to kind of recap where we came from with part 1, we talked about this tendency to blame it on the media, and we kind of blame the media for all of society's ills without really teasing out what that means when we talk about the media. A lot of times I find students lump everything together, whether it's advertising or movies or social media or news media. So what are we talking about here? But really what we're focusing in on, we focus in on kind of all of that as information that's coming at us. But in part 1, we talked more about the news media and how it's a journalist's job to actually hold power accountable, which is crucial in a democracy. And this talk is part of the college's Democracy Commitment program, which Kevin Navratil heads up. So we are relating this to aspects of a democracy, and how, there's this term of watchdog that, a lot of people actually don't know, that, a journalist's job is to be that watchdog, to hold power to account, and to be our eyes and ears as citizens. So, there's kind of a real problem here as this trust in the news media has eroded over the years. And the percentage of people with no trust in the news media is at a record high, or in mass media, I should say. So to function in a democracy, we really need a set of agreed upon facts to make decisions. But we can't even agree that there is such a thing as a fact, sometimes it seems. We have people talking about alternative facts and, the term fake news thrown around every time we turn around. So it's really, there's an erosion of trust that's led to an erosion of truth. And then we kind of talked about some of the causes of this problem, everything from the media's complicity in this. The media, the news media, has blurred the lines between reporting and opinion and between news and entertainment. Then you have the rise of citizen journalism and, of course, social media, where basically anybody is sort of a journalist in a way, but it discounts the idea that that journalism is actually a professional field that requires education and training, and there is actually a set of ethics involved, which we will talk about a little bit later. Um, We also have media consolidation as a factor and the decline of local news with layoffs in newsrooms all around the country. So we're really reducing the number of local watchdogs that are keeping an eye on, things like political corruption or just power getting out of control. And then you also, you can see on YouTube, videos where every local news station in the country is like saying almost the exact same words. In fact, going by a script. And that happens because of this handful of media companies owning the media in this country. So media consolidation is a big factor. We can't ignore the factor of Donald Trump, though it didn't start with him. He did consistently call the news media the enemy of the people, which, if you think of the news media as the watchdogs and as the eyes and ears of citizens, we're not the enemy of the people, we are the people. So, that's kind of undermining this trust and truth. And then we'll talk a little bit more later about filter bubbles, but they really come in and reinforce that division and distrust and make us vulnerable to things like conspiracy theories and that sort of thing. So that's kind of just a recap of where we were in part one. And so now I'll turn it back to Tish to take us into part two.
Thanks, Lisa. And we are definitely going to be I think talking about all of these issues, or going pulling it in through our conversation today, so we can kind of keep that in mind. And one of the things that I think, Lisa, you touched on in our first talk and then just reminded us again, is that the internet kind of flattens everything. We all, we're looking at things and the information that's coming at us, and it all kind of looks the same. So a social media post, a news post, a random, magazine post, like all of that content just kind of looks similar. Sorry, I just had a little technical difficulty with my PowerPoint here. So let's pull back a little and look at the news in context of all of this other kind of information that might be coming in at us. So as a librarian, one of the things I think about when I'm thinking about information is that information is created through different processes by different kinds of people for different purposes and different audiences. And if we can identify what kind of information we're looking at, it's often much easier then to make some judgments about its credibility, about how it might be used, how it might be useful to me, and how I should consider it in relationship to all of this other information that might be coming in at me. So that's really what this slide is doing. It's taking us from a social media post, which we know is, can be created by any of us at any time, any moment, down through a scholarly article, which is definitely a very exclusive kind of information. It's created by experts in a field. It has all kinds of gatekeepers. So we have a very accessible piece of information and a very, not quite as accessible piece of information, but their credibility is really determined by that process of creation. So let me break this down a little bit more. So one of the things that we might think about when looking at a piece of information, it's maybe a social media post, is who is the intended audience, who is creating this content, how long does it take to publish this source, what kind of research might go into publishing this source, and then what's the editorial process in creating this source. So when we're talking about this content in a class, I often ask students, if you've ever had a class with me, you've probably done this exercise, if we know that a social media post is, thrown out there as quickly as something comes into my head, I can put it on the internet, what are some of the problems with that? And that, of course, is credibility. That information may not be true. No one's checked it. There's no process for confirming that this is truth or fiction. And then we might also talk about what is advantageous about it. And so a social media post gives us the information as it's happening on the ground. So when we're thinking about political crises or extreme weather events, anything that requires like a view of the people, we can get that information very quickly from a social media post, and that can be very helpful. So we might sometimes really need to use a social media post as we're gathering information. And then we can do the same thing with a scholarly article. It's excellent when we're doing research, if we're looking for expert perspectives, and not just perspectives, but actual research that people have done on various topics. But it's also, again, problematic if you are looking for information that's very recent. A scholarly article, because it takes so long to go through an editorial process where you have other experts confirming that research, it takes years before that research is then published. And so we might talk about how we can use that in scholarly research, but maybe it's not the thing that we might use day to day. And then we have all of this information kind of in between that, once again, if we think about some of these questions about the audience, about the writer, and the editorial process, gives us some clues about how we might use it. So blog posts, you know, an expert might be writing about their experience in the field. So like, I'm thinking like a doctor might have a blog about their work in a hospital. It might share perspectives, but it's not going through a medical board before that information gets published. But it still might be very useful and interesting. But also, if that doctor starts talking about, I don't know, the engineering of a bridge, that person isn't an expert in that, right? So blogs can be very useful, and there might be a lot of research that goes into them. But again, that editing, like having someone check that information, that feature isn't there. Same thing with a Wikipedia article. Wikipedia is amazing, but the editorial process doesn't kick in until after someone's already published that information. So I think, you know, something that I think we talked about in the first section that maybe Lisa can speak to a little bit more is that the editorial process is a critical component when we're thinking about credibility. And that's why the news article or even a magazine article, we want to look closely at that editorial process. So even in breaking news, when news is being, you know, reported at the time of the event, there's still a little bit of checking, perspective done by an editor before that's going out into the world. And then certainly as we dig further into different kinds of news content, there's a much more rigorous editorial process. And we might look at different news organizations and compare those editorial processes to think about how that information is going to be, how credible that information is, what kind of bias might be within that editorial process. We can really dig in and examine that.
Yeah, I think that one of the things about, you know, the news media and a trained journalist and the ethics involved is that you're always trying to balance immediacy and accuracy. And so, yeah, there's going to, you know, journalists use social media now, both in terms of their reporting and finding sources and finding out information, but also in, you know, tweeting out, you know, live tweeting from a news event. And so journalists have to kind of balance these things as well. So if you are tweeting from you know, a protest or something, you know, may need to be correcting yourself as you get more information. But hope you're still trying to balance that need for accuracy with that need for speed. And so, you know, that's the editorial process that a story will go through. I was just talking with my Com 154 student publications students last night about this, as they, as editors of the Glacier, work with freelance writers. You know, that part of their responsibility is to check for accuracy, check for sources, look for holes in the stories, and any writer needs an editor to do that, and especially if you're working under speed conditions, because you might miss something. And so that process is really valuable. And of course, you know, social media posts and most blog posts don't go through that editorial process.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize, looking at this spectrum of information, like there isn't a particular kind of information that's bad. It's just we have to really think about how we're going to be using that information or how that information might be impacting us and dig in a little bit deeper before making a decision maybe about sharing that information or about how we're going to use that information. So again, kind of going back to these questions of who's the audience, who wrote it, what's that editorial process. We can really dig into any one of these kinds of information to learn more about it. And we'll do that a little bit with news. We'll kind of break it down. So as we've already alluded to, breaking news is something that's happening in the moment. My go-to example is always a hurricane. I think we've probably all seen on TV or on the internet, like some reporter standing out in like this wild rain, like getting almost blown away. So we can see what's happening in the moment. And that can be very useful to us, especially when we're thinking about, if we have a hurricane or a thunderstorm or a tornado that's bearing down on us, we kind of want to know that's happening, right? So that breaking news is very important and useful. And then a news report is something that's going to be written, I think of it as the day after, but anytime after the event where there's much more information, where reporters have had time to look at like the full scope of the events. They can put together a report of all of the, and again, in this hurricane example, can talk about, the wind speeds throughout the course of the hurricane, what kind of damage was done, what communities were impacted. So you can get a really full story. And although breaking news, I think, is the exciting news that we want to listen to or read about, when it's not impacting us directly, it might be useful to think about waiting for that news report. We talk in classes about the way emotions might impact our reading of the news or our understanding of the news. And if we're sharing breaking news as it's happening, we might be sharing news that isn't accurate eventually. It also might hype us up in a way that isn't super helpful. If we can't do something immediately about the issue at hand, again, it might be better just to wait until that news report so we can get a full picture, and that might be the news that we would want to share. So breaking news and news reports, those are things to like, each of these different kinds of news, I think it's useful to know what you're looking at, especially on the internet, which again, it kind of collapses everything. And even some news sources will collapse everything. So if you look at their page, not all news sources are good about labeling what each of these kinds of news are. So knowing what to look for, it can be really helpful because again, it's going to impact the way you use that information personally, but also again, if you're doing research or looking for particular kinds of information. So now we're moving into analysis and investigative reporting. So analysis, as the slide says, it provides an interpretation of a news event. And this isn't, like, here's my opinion on the news event, but it's really putting that news event into context. Might bring in historical perspectives or political perspectives, like basically situating a news event so that we can understand it a little bit better. If you've ever listened to a WBEZ drive, they talk about how NPR does that and, take that for what it is. But that context can be really useful, especially when we're reading about events that are happening, outside of our particular maybe expertise. So wildfires happening in California, it's useful to know that maybe there's a historic drought or that, these fires are part of some larger issue around climate change. And that's what that analysis might do for us.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that analysis does kind of blur the line into opinion, though. And so when we're talking about analysis, it's filtering, it may be providing context, but it's also kind of filtering the news through a particular perspective that the reporter has or the publication has. And the Columbia Journalism Review recently had an article about how there is this increased emphasis on analysis in news coverage. And you see that on, especially TV news, there's this blurring of the lines, and we kind of talked about that in part one, between, what's straight news and what's analysis and what's opinion. And, so there's this blurring of the lines where it used to be more separate. The article that I was referring to says news organizations should have to explain themselves to communicate the difference between the news department and the editorial page. And it says that more than a quarter of Americans do not understand that distinction between, which I think is kind of what you're getting into in your next slide, but between news and opinion, news and editorial. But I think that also applies to analysis and even investigative reporting, that there's that responsibility on us as readers to tell the difference because it's not as clearly labeled as it once was.
Absolutely. Thanks for that additional perspective. So this leads us into investigative reporting, which, I think you allude to in your opening comments, because really this is, when I think about journalism, like this is, I feel like what journalists are trained to do is to like connect these dots and reveal to, and like it's their responsibility to like provide citizens with this insight into government or into corporations that otherwise I would not have. And so this is the kind of reporting that we see around the Flint water crisis, around Me Too, and of course, what's being investigated, how it's investigated, that all might be impacted by the news organization that these journalists are reporting for, and personal biases, but they typically are uncovering and connecting research that you and I don't really have the same kind of access to. And without that investigative journalism, we wouldn't know about these large scale issues that are happening in society. So recognizing that and how useful that is and how important that is like journalism as a watchdog, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, a great example of that, if you haven't seen the movie Spotlight, which won the Academy Award a couple years ago, to the great delight of journalists everywhere, because it really depicts journalism at work, and it's based on a true story of the Boston Globe that uncovered this widespread abuse by Catholic priests, and if you watch that movie, it really shows the kind of process that an investigative reporter goes through, and the responsibility, and the decisions about when to publish something and when to wait for another source to confirm it, and how to go through documents to really look into this, so that there is a lot that goes into a good investigative piece, and that's where that watchdog role really comes in.
This is a throwback, but if you haven't watched The Wire, do. It's just a great show, but I think it's season 4 or season 5 that really focuses on the role of investigative reporting by the Baltimore Sun. It's phenomenal. We talk about other representations all day, but we'll move this along. So the things that I think I often hear students say when we talk about news in a classroom setting is that, news is biased, it's just opinions. I hear that a lot, and it always concerns me because I do think that, especially recently, there's a conflation of, there is so much opinion out there, and it is easily mistaken for what we think of as news. And so this is where editorial and op-eds come in. Editorials are typically written by a staff of a news source. So some places are really good at making this clear. I'm thinking of the New York Times. If there's a big article by the editorial board, they'll be very clear about that, versus their op-eds, which are generally invited people. So folks that may have some expertise in a particular area might be invited to write their opinion about a particular issue at hand. A lot of current controversy, I think, around news places like New York Times, I think is the one that I think about the most, often comes because of op-eds and who they invite and what kinds of opinions get shared in these different platforms. And these are definitely intended to be opinion pieces or perspectives that are not they're not unbiased. Of course they're biased. Hopefully they're also formed out of some sort of understanding or expertise, but they definitely are not the same as a news report or investigative journalism.
Yeah, funny thing. So my husband was a long time sports columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, and a column, so it's different than an editorial. An editorial is the official position of the news organization, whereas a column is just that writer's opinion. And a column should be indicated by, the writer's, usually a photo of the writer, a mugshot of the writer, and their name kind of in a prominent sort of graphic way. So this is separate from just a news story. But it was funny because, I can't count the number of times that my husband Greg would get emails or, responses to articles saying, well, that's just your opinion. And you're saying your opinion, and he's like, yeah, that's my job, I'm a columnist, I'm supposed to write my opinion. But it just kind of shows that people didn't really understand that difference.
Right, and that even varies from, like, editorials and op-eds have been a long part of the journalistic tradition, right? Like in newspapers, you always had, they were physical. Like this isn't something that's new to the internet age. But I do think that, like, when we look at blogs, that is something that is very internet based. I think is really come about or become popularized in the last like 10 to 15 years, where news organizations will have a whole section of blogs. And it isn't, I think it's treated differently generally. Like the way those are edited, the way they are maintained by that news organization. So this is even when a blog is part of a news organization, it's still much less structured than an editorial or an op-ed. And often blogs are not connected to any kind of news organization. It's just people who might be journalists in their professional life, but then also have a blog where they're sharing their perspectives. Many people, I think, use Twitter in that way, or newsletters, things like that. So that's what blog information is like.
Yeah, and I think blogs can really vary too, because they don't go through that editorial process. But, you can have a blog by, someone I follow is Heather Cox Richardson, who's a historian. And she basically started a blog on Facebook in a way, where she was writing kind of a letter to the American people. But I find that she puts things into perspective for me of what the daily news is. But she's coming at it from a certain point of view, and so you have to take that into account. And that's pretty much, a blog is a representation of that person's point of view. So they can be interesting and useful in just sort of getting a different perspective on things, but you have to take that with a grain of salt as well, and look at the credentials of the person who's writing the blog.
Right. Absolutely. And again, like, none of these pieces of information are bad. It's just knowing what they are is really critical as we, especially as they are coming at us really quickly, to like determine how we're going to use them in our academic and personal lives. And so that idea of information coming at us is kind of what I want to move us into talking about, because I think this is really important and something that we don't touch on very often when we do like our information literacy sessions in the library. We often frame research as this specific need that we have. Like, students will have an assignment, they have to go out and find information, they're going to use a database, they have these like very clear guidelines for what they need to use. But that's not actually how most of us engage with information in our day-to-day lives. And so we want to think about the information systems that are creating our access and creating the world in which we engage with that information. So information systems, the architectures, infrastructure, and fundamental belief systems that shape our information environment. So really, this is like the air that we're breathing, right? Including the fact that these systems are social, influenced by the biases and assumptions by the humans who create and use them. So we're going to talk a little bit about algorithms, which show up for us, I think, us regular people who aren't actually working at Google or at Facebook, programming algorithms. It just shows up in the way we engage with, I think most often, social media. But all of algorithms are used to drive kind of decision making around almost everything. So algorithms use data that's collected through our searches, through our social media, and then that is used to determine what kind of information then is shown back to us. So it's kind of this loop that we go through. And I think, if you have ever, I don't know, been talking about something with a friend and then suddenly an advertisement for that shows up in your social media feed and you've been freaked out, that's algorithms at work. So, which I think happens quite a lot. So the other thing that algorithms do is that, my searches through Google give me back results that are related to, where I live, my past searches. It's gathered so much information about me that when I search for something, I get information that's really relevant to me personally. But that extends to all of my searches, which means, I may get a very different set of search results when I'm doing research than someone who is sitting right next to me who has a very different, maybe, search history. And so when we start to think about algorithms, we need to think about how an algorithm might impact the way we're viewing the world. That it's not just a mathematical formula that's bringing back like randomized information. It's targeted to create a situation and a perspective for me that benefits, Google, or it benefits Facebook, or it benefits these different companies. And that is one of the huge reasons why we have people who are on very different sides of reality, like that we cannot see the world because we actually literally are getting different kinds of information. So we need to be conscious consumers of information, but we also, I think, really need to think about how information is being produced and created and then given to us so that we can not just be good consumers, but really think about the structures and demand things like policy changes and things like that.
Yeah, I think this is so fascinating. Just this, first of all, this idea that it's not just about the information we seek, but the information that kind of washes over us, and how, you talked about how we see the world, but, if we're talking about the erosion of truth, we all have different worlds. We're not actually seeing the same world. We're seeing different worlds coming at us. Um, and it does help explain a lot of what's going on in the world today, or the world. Maybe there isn't the world, just like there isn't the truth. Uh, I don't know. It's just fascinating, and I think it ties back into the talk last week by Laura Lawson Collins, our psychology professor, who was talking about how we fall for conspiracy theories and how, this information is geared toward, it is kind of freaky when you see something pop up in your Facebook feed, that you were talking about, and you never actually searched for anything that had to do with that. And to think about all of the information that's collected out there about all of us, not to sound paranoid, but it's shaping our world, the world that we experience, the world that we see. And so it's no wonder that our worlds are not, it's not a Venn diagram. Sometimes there's
Right.
no crossover between my world and this other person's world. I just find that fascinating.
Yeah, and it's when you realize that it's a little bit terrifying. And also it has real consequences. It's not just that like I don't maybe understand my neighbor. It's reinforcing biases and all kinds of inequities. So whether that's like people don't get a home loan because of historical biases in the data, so that the algorithm isn't pulling accurate information, to search engine results that are like flat out racist. Um, there's real world consequences for the way these algorithms are working. And I wanted to introduce Sophia Noble, who's done research around this. And I have like a 1.5 minute clip that, if the technology works, I'd love to play, because there's this growing body of research that really explores this issue of algorithms magnifying biases. Just recently in the news, there's been talk about the way algorithms working on Facebook to do that. I think new things are popping up all the time about different, so it's search engines, it's social media that privilege some people and then actively work against others. So I'm going to try to play this, and then we can chat about it a little bit. See how it goes.
I don't think we're getting volume.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I don't think we're getting volume.
Oh no.
Volume.
You're not? Okay. It's very loud on my end. But if you're not getting volume, then here, let me. Still no? Okay, then we won't worry about it. So what I'll just summarize quickly. And I will recommend, we have the book Algorithms of Oppression. Please go to your local library and check it out. So she does a lot of research around the way, again, search engines will bring back all kinds of racist information, and that there's no context for the information that you get when you go to Google. So just this past week, Facebook admitted that it's known for years that Instagram's algorithm harms girls' self-esteem, that the kinds of information young girls are getting through Instagram and the kinds of images that pop up for them is really harmful. And YouTube has become notorious for its ability to just kind of bring back all kinds of results. And there's this, it's become notorious for being a successful tool in promoting and recruiting white nationalists. So there's a ton of, so people actually use things like Google or YouTube or Facebook to actively recruit or actively promote misinformation around all kinds of biases. The most, something that Sophia Noble talks about in Algorithms of Oppression is Dylan Roof, who is a white nationalist who opened fire at a Charleston church with mostly Black congregants. And I just have a short bit to illustrate Sophia Noble's point. So according to the manifesto, Roof allegedly typed Black on white crime in a Google search to make sense of the news reporting on Trayvon Martin. What Roof found was information that confirmed a patently false notion that Black violence on white Americans is an American crisis. And she goes on to say, what we find in search engines about people and culture is important. They oversimplify complex phenomena, they obscure any struggle over understanding, and they can mask history. Search results can reframe our thinking and deny us the ability to engage deeply with essential information and knowledge we need, knowledge that has traditionally been learned through teachers, books, history, and experience. So again, it's that idea of do your own research without the context and structure of without context, that can almost be impossible. And so many of us don't necessarily have the expertise to do our own research. And so that's what, classes are for. It's what having conversations with people is for. It's what a library is for, to help put all of these pieces of information into context so that we can make really smart decisions and understand the situation better. And on the internet isn't doing that for us, right? And I think this next slide really gets into like the problems with if all of our information is coming at us through the internet or social media, that is a problem. And so we can see that students get most of their news from their peers or social media. And so this is definitely an issue we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, and I think, that again ties back to some of the points in the conspiracy talk about kind of our need to belong, and how our information and the way that we perceive the world is really influenced by our tribe and our in-group. And so if we're getting most of our news from our peers, whether that's via social media or other means, we're just really reinforcing things that we already think, and not expanding and not doing our research. We're not actually going out and finding out the information. And I think it also goes back to that first slide that you presented of the different types of information, and the process that they go through. When we say do your own research, that doesn't mean, oh, I'm, gonna Google it. I saw a funny cartoon about, that showed like a guy sitting at his computer, and he was calling out to his wife, hey, honey, I, found out something that, no other scientist has ever found just by Googling. It was funnier than that, but you get the idea. but it's this idea that we could just sit down with Google and do our research and find out something that, scientists who've been studying this and who've gone through peer reviews and scholarly processes, haven't figured out through that process, is just sort of ludicrous, really.
Right. Like really thinking about what it means to have expertise in something, and I think being a little bit humble and just recognizing, oh, like I'm not an expert in most things. So I need to like find other experts to explain stuff to me, and that's fine. Like that's not a sign of weakness. It is absolutely like the way we should be doing it. Like I need scientists to explain science to me. Like that's a really reasonable, I think, expectation. So this does bring us to like, what do we do? Like it can feel a little overwhelming. Like there's bad information. It's coming at us really quickly. These algorithms are bringing us terrible information. But there are some strategies that we can take to help us in the process. So librarians are talking about this a lot. Like it's a big part of what we do. And there was a new article that really presented this idea of proactive evaluation. So often, especially in an academic setting, again, we talk about information like it's static, like students are going out, examining information, and then choosing which one to use for, their research purposes. But again, that's not the way information works. So we have to acknowledge that information is active, targeted, capable of influencing action, and fundamentally alters the position of the student in the active evaluation. So again, information is it's coming at us quickly all the time. So one of the things that I think was covered really well in Laura Lawson-Collins' talk, and my colleague Troy, I think, has done a lot of research around, and we'll be talking about more in the future, is this idea of our feelings and how our feelings impact so much the way we both understand the information that's coming at us, and then what we do with the information that we've found. So this particular, just to put the illustration into context, there was an article about the first 100 days of COVID reporting. So it analyzed both the text of news reports around COVID, but also the images. And they found that all of the images were in some way coded in these 5 different ways that included, so the themes of all of the images that popped up were fear, hopelessness, loneliness, determination, and grief. And so, if you're feeling some things at the beginning of, or, March and April of 2020, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think a lot of us were glued to social media feeds, to the news, and felt a lot during that period. And we were probably sharing that information, pretty actively with people. The problem with all of these feelings around news is that it can often make us kind of lose a sense of perspective. It's easy, I think, when you read something and have a strong emotion. So let's say I read something that makes me furious. I can't believe, you know, the governor's doing this thing. And then I shoot off, you know, that whatever I read to my Facebook page. And then other people also get angry and are sharing that. And if I didn't stop and like check to make sure that information is accurate, the context of the information that I read, I might be sharing misinformation. It's just much more likely to happen that misinformation spreads around issues that cause extreme emotion. And so I think we see this in a lot of places. I know other folks are going to be covering this more in different places, so I don't want to spend too much time here. But I do think, like, just really recognizing that all of this information that's coming at us, like we have to know that we have to recognize that it's making us feel things, and then we can maybe step back and wonder, use a little curiosity, like, why do I feel that? And what do I do with that feeling? And maybe I need to think about what this information means to me before spreading it or sharing it.
Yeah, you know, fear is one of the most powerful emotions. It's such a primal emotion. And one of the things we talk about in my Intro to Mass Communications course is how advertising plays on our feelings. So when if we include that in the media, but you know, even with if you're not just looking at ads, if you're looking at, you know, the motives maybe behind a blog post or a, you know, a news article or a social media post, the motives behind the person creating that may be to sow that fear in us, so that, you know, the way a lot of commercials work is they'll create a fear in us, a danger in our minds of some sort, and then promote their product as the savior that will, you know, the thing that will save us from that thing that we should be fearing. So if you think about even like those funny mayhem commercials, you know, I'm a raccoon in your attic, and you know, and they look like they're causing all kinds of damage, and so you have this little fear that, oh, what if I get a raccoon in my attic? How am I going to pay for the damage, and what's going to happen to me? And you know, what's going to solve the problem? Well, Allstate, you know, you're in good hands, and you know, it's all going to be taken care of. So you know, we have to be kind of conscious that that is a strategy for getting, you know, some people are trying to get us to feel that fear so that they can sell themselves or their political, you know, solution or whatever it is as the thing that's going to save us from the thing we should be fearing that maybe we didn't know we feared in the first place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the things that happens, especially when we're feeling our feelings or you know, we're getting worked up, is that we end up being trapped again in these filter bubbles. So if we're getting all of our information from one particular place, it might be feeding into that whole process. So what, you know, another good piece of advice for kind of like managing the wall of information, this flood of information, is really just kind of recognizing and owning your bias. So I think knowing where you know, align is really important. So, you know I have a whole set of biases because, and that's really helpful for me because I know if I'm kind of only looking at people within my circle, I might need to like get more information from around me to get a full picture of any, you know, political situation or really, I mean, any situation at all. So this media bias chart can be really helpful. So if you are getting all of your information from Rachel Maddow over on the way left, you're probably getting a ton of great information, but that information is also being filtered through a particular kind of bias and a particular perspective. So you might want to kind of read some things over here in the middle that might give you a slightly different perspective. You can also read things over here on the right to understand, again, like where the full spectrum of information is. And there's a number of sites out there now. I refer to allsides.com a lot, which actually you can put in an issue. So if there's something that, I think this works especially well if you're going to be having a conversation in a class about a particular topic, or if you just want to know like what the full spectrum of conversation is about something, like you put in your topic and it will give you articles from the far left all the way through the center, and then the far right. And I think, again, understanding how that conversation is happening can be very useful for a whole bunch of reasons. I think it cuts down on the immediacy of sharing information. If you stop and say, oh, you know what, I'm going to see like what other news organizations are saying about this before I share this one article. But it also makes it easier to maybe talk to friends and family across a political spectrum, because you kind of know what information they're getting and can speak to that, and maybe you can have some conversations about what it means to be on these two different perspectives. I think we are coming close to our time. I feel like the filter bubbles we've mentioned before, but again, identifying where your bubble is and finding ways to seek information outside of that bubble is really useful. And some strategies, again, for verifying the kind of information that you're looking at. Lateral reading is basically just, you come across a piece of information, you open up a new tab, and you Google that, whether it's a news organization or a person who's tweeting, what can you find out about that piece of information? This lateral reading strategy came out of Stanford History Education Group that looked at students, historians, and then fact checkers, and gave them two sites, one, a reputable organization, and one like some wacky, like totally biased, weird organization, both along the same, but they both looked super professional. And the students and historians couldn't figure out which one was the bad one. But fact checkers did, because they just immediately started doing some research on the organizations themselves, were able to identify which one was, a problem, had some biases. And so just doing some Googling about the information that you're looking at can be super helpful. So that's what lateral reading is. And Sift is a similar strategy. So again, stop, and that's a good time to recognize those feelings. So before you share or spread some misinformation, you're gonna do that lateral reading, investigate the source. And often investigating the source means you should find better coverage. And I think this too speaks to that media bias chart. If you recognize that the source you're looking at is on any extreme, find additional information. Just do your homework. And then looking at the specific quotes or the context of those quotes within an article can be really useful.
Yeah, before I kind of jump into a little bit about the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics and kind of how we become our own editors, since we are running a little low on time, maybe we should see about taking some questions here. And it looks like we have a question from Nick, who says, sometimes it's hard to get those political conversations going without invoking rage. What would you recommend to do in those situations? Are some topics simply off limits? Does this limit our discourse? Tish, do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, I think sometimes it is really hard to have those conversations. And I think it really depends on your relationship with the person. Context, I think, is everything. So if you are, I mean, people invoke Thanksgiving dinner all the time. I don't know why, but if you are at a family dinner and like you start a conversation that you know is going to provoke rage, like maybe that's not your best strategy. Like maybe that's not the time to have a conversation about a heated political situation. I think sharing information like, oh, I found this article really interesting. What do you think? Might open up a dialogue, because that person might be willing to share something that they have read on the same topic. And you can talk about, like, then you have something to work with, right? Like you might then talk about how maybe your article is from a particular perspective, that their article is from a particular perspective. You can break it down together. You can talk it out. but also someone has to be willing to have that conversation. And people work on their own timelines around those issues. But I think that like one-on-one being open and sharing what you know, without it being attack, I think is probably a good way to start that conversation.
Yeah, and I think even bringing up some of the things that you've talked about today, Tish, you know, about kind of how filter bubbles work, or how, you know, we sort of have certain information that comes at us, and understanding that we're sort of living in different worlds in terms of our perspectives, and understanding the emotions that come along with that. You know, maybe opening a discussion in those kind of more general terms would lead to the ability to talk in more specific terms about certain issues. Apparently, there was also a question in the Q&A regarding using DuckDuckGo as a search engine to avoid algorithms. Tish, do you have an answer for that?
You know, I haven't spent a ton of time with DuckDuckGo, but I do know that it is an alternative to Google, that people who I think are concerned about privacy issues, especially, have talked about. There's other, I think this is a part of technology that I'm not up to speed on, but I think is really exciting. There are people who are creating alternatives to Google, and other like really popular search engines that do focus more on privacy, that do less tracking. There are people who are developing social media that doesn't work on the same algorithmic bias that Facebook does. So if you are finding those alternatives, yes, absolutely use those. So there's definitely ways to kind of avoid the Googleization of things. So I have not personally used DuckDuckGo, so I don't know how well it works, but I do know that there's a lot happening in tech right now that is around those issues, and I think we'll see more and more of those, I think, as time goes on.
And then we have a question about, can you speak to how the model has evolved regarding significant cuts to investigative journalism versus the rise of opinion-based commentators like Tucker Carlson and Rachel Maddow that are more popular and generate higher ratings? Yeah, I mean, that's really, I think we touched on that in part one, but you know, with a 24-hour, when the advent of 24-hour news cycles came in, with CNN and Fox News and so on, you know, they've got to fill that time with something. And so it's hard to fill 24 hours with just kind of straight news. So they start bringing in more and more commentators and more analysis, and then of course things, you know, became more and more divided. So it does, you know, again comes back to that blurring of lines between what's actual news and what's commentary. And so I think we just, as consumers of media, we have to be the ones responsible for examining what is this that's coming to me. And it, you know, it's gotten harder. It's a full-time job practically to figure this out. You know, as I said in my class, you know, the internet is a great democratizer, or it was meant to be. And there are many benefits to the idea that, you know, we have access to all of this information in different ways, but at the same time, it's put all this responsibility on us to become our own editors, basically, our own gatekeepers of, you know, what's important and what's factual, what's, you know, something I can trust and what's credible. We constantly kind of have to be asking ourselves that question. And so that was one of the things that, you know, just to jump in a bit on some of the other slides that we had, um, I was thinking about that aspect of us as consumers sort of having to take on the role that a managing editor of a newspaper maybe used to have, and really, you know, looking at what's news, and, you know, the credibility of the the quality of journalism that's coming to us. And I think that being aware that there is this code of ethics that the Society of Professional Journalists had put together, and kind of using some of those standards can help us judge what we're seeing. So the code has four main principles: seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable and transparent. And I don't want to really go through all of those, but Tish, maybe you could change the slide just so I can hit on one of them. So I was actually looking at this example of a social media post that it says, military doctor, the COVID vaccine program has killed more young active duty people than COVID did. So this might be a social media post that you might see, and it's coming from Health Impact News, which sounds official and sounds like, maybe a credible source. And we see the first paragraph is all about this Dr. Lee Merritt, who completed an orthopedic surgery residency in the United States Navy, and served 9 years as a Navy physician and surgeon, where she also studied bioweapons before returning to Rochester, where she was the only woman to be appointed in the UEA Goldstein Fellow of Spinal Surgery. So, we should believe her, right? But putting into practice some of the things we talked about, what's our emotional response here? It's appealing to our sense of patriotism. No, we should be protecting the people who are protecting us, not killing them with this stupid vaccine, right? We need to take care of them, especially the young active duty people. So it seems legit, and it's this military doctor, supposedly. But if you change the slide, if we think about, you can go back one, yeah, the code of ethics is asking us to verify information as journalists, verify information before releasing it, and use original sources whenever possible, provide context, don't misrepresent or oversimplify. So you have to ask yourself as the consumer, how did the writer obtain this information? Is more than one source being used to confirm the accuracy of the information? Are complex issues being reduced to something that's good or bad? So if you can go on to the next slide, skip over that one, just to sort of speed this up. But other questions to ask yourself are, do you know who the writer's sources are? Do the sources have expertise or firsthand experience? Do the sources have a hidden agenda or something to gain by painting this issue in a certain light? And that's really the case here. I found this by using one of the resources that Tish recommends, called a site called Media Bias Fact Check. And the fact checker did what a real journalist would do in this situation and went to the source of information that would actually know something about this. So went to the Department of Defense and found that it actually was not true. That there had not been any deaths from the vaccine as of September 14th, 2021. And no fully vaccinated service members had died from COVID-19. There have been 43 deaths from COVID-19 among active military members as of September 8th. So, but this post, and then the story that you click on to read more, it sort of sounds like it's something that is factual, and it turns out it really isn't. So I know I kind of rushed through that, but I think we need to think about those, the way that real journalists are trained, and are they actually following some of these ethical codes in producing the information? Okay, so it's looking like a couple more questions here. Kevin says, based upon the rise of these types of commentators, it would also be interesting to hear your perspective regarding how Tucker Carlson was sued and his own Fox lawyer said he has not he's not stating actual facts about the topics he discusses, and instead is engaging in exaggeration and non-literal commentary. Many viewers may not realize this. As you're pointing out now, the onus is on us as citizens to have a lot of time and expertise to sift through the current media climate. And yeah, I mean, Tucker, the ruling in the court case was actually that Tucker Carlson, the judge said, is not actually producing news and therefore cannot be expected to abide by some of these standards. But do viewers know that he's not actually producing news? I suspect not. Most people can't tell the difference. And so, yeah, again, it comes back to us to see whether our news channels, our sources of information are actually abiding by this, ethics that responsible journalists should be abiding by.
Right, and getting that outside perspective. So if you are reading on Fox News and just like dig into Tucker Carlson, like you're just going to get more information about him. Whereas like going and reading about his news program from a few different sources, you'll find pretty quickly, what he's actually about. And so I think again, like really thinking through, doing some investigation, like not taking things immediately and sharing them, that is thinking that there's a process that we have to go through. And also, since we know that algorithms are bringing things to us in those different ways, thinking about how we might push back against that. So that's a bigger policy issue that we want to be thinking about when we're voting for folks, when policy issues are coming up around the internet, around privacy, around all of these issues. And if you're interested in becoming one of those folks who develops an alternative to Facebook, run with it. We need it. So I think those are all things to consider as well. And there's lots of sources or resources on the internet that can help you figure some of this out. So if you don't know offhand, if what you're looking at is a biased source, there's lots of places you can go. Any of these particular websites will help you do that, but also please stop by the library and talk to me or any of our librarians. We can definitely help with that. I think all of your professors would also be happy to help you with that. So if you're especially thinking things for a class, that's a good resource as well.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things we can do as individuals to check things out. There are things that, at a societal level, I think we should be doing as well. And Time Magazine did a story about the importance of teaching cyber citizenship. So as consumers begin to demand accountability from our media outlets and support those who are holding to these ethical standards, that's something we can do as consumers. We can refuse to spread misinformation on social media, so we can use some of these strategies, as Tish said, to check things out before we, push share, the share button. Or as Time Magazine suggests, we can make teaching cyber citizenship a national priority from a young age. So, high school students are required to take consumer ed. Why not media consumer ed? This is really something that's so important to our democracy, to understand how, information, is a commodity, how it's being produced, how we're, consuming it, and what we can do to protect ourselves and our country and our society by protecting ourselves from misinformation. And of course, if you want to become a better media consumer, I would advocate trying your hand at being a media producer. And so you could take my class, Media Writing, Journalism 111, and look at it from that side. And how do we go about finding a story and making sure that it's well reported and well written. Little plug there.
Fantastic. I think we have come to the end of our time. So just want to say thanks, Lisa, for being in conversation about all of this. And if folks have questions, please feel free to follow up. And I hope that you will go out and apply some of these ideas as you are flooded with the information as you're looking at your phones this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks, Tish. It's always fun to talk with you about this stuff, and so I encourage everyone to stop by the library and have a conversation with Tish and any of the other great librarians who know their stuff, and we're very lucky to have them. So, so yeah, it's always fun. Wish we could have heard Kevin's voice because
I know.
interesting things to say too, and chime in with the conversation. But
Yeah.
but we made it.
Yeah, thanks to the Democracy Commitment. It was so grateful for that you hosted us, even though you couldn't be a part of the conversation, Kevin. So